Okay, let's jump right into this deep dive. Today, we're tackling, well, a huge topic, drawing from this stack of sources you've shared with us, the early history of the lands that would eventually become the United States.
Exactly. Yeah, we're peeling back the layers here to understand the incredible complexity, the diversity that existed on this continent long before European ships even showed up.
Right.
And then, yeah, we'll get into that profound and often, let's be honest, incredibly gritty collision of worlds that followed the dawn of colonization.
Our mission with this deep dive really is to move beyond those simple narratives you sometimes get. We want to pull out the most important insights from your material. Really explore the diverse, dynamic societies that were here before 1492 and understand the complex, sometimes brutal consequences of those first encounters.
Think of this as your essential shortcut, maybe, to being well-informed about the overlooked foundations of American history. It's a deep dive into what was really here, you know?
What really happened?
Yeah, and what really happened from the very beginning.
And the sources, well, they immediately challenge some common assumptions, don't they? Like, for instance, did you know that some urban centers north of Mesoamerica were actually bigger than many major European cities at the time?
Exactly. Or that, sophisticated democracies and matrilineal societies were already flourishing here.
Those are the kind of fascinating details we're going to explore.
And yes, we'll also have to confront some unsettling realities that standard accounts often gloss over.
Right. And your sources are really clear on this, but the story of this continent, it just does not begin with Columbus. Or any European arrival, for that matter.
Not at all. For thousands of years before that, this was a vibrant, populated land, home to millions of people living in hundreds of distinct indigenous nations.
And I think the first crucial point from the material is just how vast that diversity was.
Oh, immense. We're not talking about a single culture here. Not even close.
Right.
They had hundreds of languages spoken, social structures ranging from, mobile hunter-gatherer bands all the way up to complex empires.
Different governments, technologies.
Vastly different forms of governance, unique technologies, incredibly rich spiritual traditions all across the continent. It was not a monolith.
Which makes that early European label Indians so problematic, doesn't it? The sources really point out how that was just an imposed term.
Totally imposed.
Yeah.
And it completely obscured this immense richness and diversity.
Yeah.
That mischaracterization, well, it led to really harmful generalizations, and it fundamentally failed to recognize the sovereignty, the distinct identities of all these individual nations.
And settlers sometimes just used whatever names they heard, maybe from enemies.
Absolutely. Or even used derogatory terms. It just further erased that complexity. So, a respectful understanding has to start by dismantling that colonial lens, taking that apart first.
Okay, let's dive into some specific examples from the sources, really illustrate this pre-Columbian world. What stands out to you first?
Well, the Mississippian culture, I think. It flourished roughly between, say, 800 and 1600 CE, mostly in the river valleys of the Midwest and Southeast.
Okay.
And it's just a perfect example of a sophisticated, large-scale society. We see evidence of these huge earthen platform mounds.
Right, the mounds.
Intensive maize agriculture, supporting really dense populations, distinctive pottery, and these extensive trade networks that crisscross the continent.
And this wasn't just simple village life, was it? The sources describe pretty complex political structures here.
Oh, yeah. Hierarchical chiefdoms. You see institutionalized social inequality, centralized power structures. And the absolute peak of this was Cahokia.
Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis.
That's the one. Between about 1050 and 1200 CE, Cahokia was an urban center on a scale we often just don't associate with North America before Europeans.
You mentioned its size earlier. How big are we talking?
Well, at its height, the estimates are around 10,000 to maybe 20,000 people living in or right around the city.
Wow.
And your sources highlight this that made it larger than many contemporary European cities, like London at the time.
Bigger than London.
Yeah. It had over 120 mounds, including that colossal monk's mound, 4 terraces. That was clearly the political heart of the city.
That scale is just incredible. And this is where we get into some of those gritty bits you mentioned. The sources highlight things that show the complex realities, even in these advanced societies.
Exactly. Because the archaeology, specifically at one burial site, Mound 72, well, it reveals some really challenging aspects.
Like what?
Well, there's one elite burial that included the remains of over 250 other individuals. And many of them show signs of being sacrificial victims.
250 people.
Yeah. And there are mass graves of young women found there too, and another group of 4 men found without their heads or hands.
Yeah, that's a stark detail. It really pushes back against any kind of overly romanticized view, doesn't it?
It does, and that's crucial, I think, for an accurate picture. While it's unsettling, it points to profound elite power, ritual violence, and a really highly stratified society.
Capable of mobilizing huge amounts of labor.
And enforcing extreme social distinctions. These are characteristics you see in many early state-level societies around the world. Daily life there revolved around farming maize, beans, squash. They lived in wattle and daub houses, even played popular games like Chunky.
Rolling stones and throwing spears.
That's the one. But Cahokia eventually declined. The sources suggest maybe environmental problems, internal issues.
Yeah,
it was largely abandoned after 1200 CE, almost completely empty by 1350. The sources point to, like you said, a combination of factors, maybe environmental degradation, deforestation, drought,
okay,
and perhaps internal unrest. It's fascinating, too. The sources suggest Cahokia was actually quite diverse. Maybe up to a third of the residents were immigrants, which might have fueled its rise, but also maybe contributed to its dissolution in the end. Complex stuff.
Shifting gears pretty dramatically now, let's look at the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy up in the northeastern woodlands. Their system of governance seems remarkably different.
Oh, it is. Very different. Initially, 5 nations, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, later joined by the Tuscarora to make 6.
Right.
United under what they call the Great Law of Peace, the Guyana-Shagoa. And its origins are ancient, definitely predating significant European contact.
What makes their government so notable based on these sources?
Well, it's the sophisticated representative democracy they developed. They had a grand council of 50 chiefs, or Hoyana.
50?
Yeah, representing the various clans within the nations. And decisions were made through extensive debate, aiming for consensus.
So they worked together but kept their own autonomy.
Exactly. It addressed common causes while preserving national autonomy. And some scholars, they draw connections like Benjamin Franklin, being aware of it, and see potential influence of this system on early American democratic thought.
And their social structure, that had a very distinctive feature too, right?
Crucially, yes.
Oh.
It was matrilineal.
Matrilineal. So descent through the mother's line.
Exactly. Descent, clan membership, property, all traced through the mother. And this structure, it gave women significant political power.
How so?
Well, the clan mothers, in particular, held immense authority. They were the ones responsible for nominating the male chiefs. And they could even depose them. They could effectively dehorn a chief who wasn't doing his job properly.
Wow. So women held real political power.
Real power. That vested a level of authority in women that was just a stark contrast to patriarchal societies back in Europe at the time.
And the Great Law of Peace itself, its main purpose was ending conflict.
Primarily, yes. Ending the constant, destructive, intertribal warfare that had been going on. It provided a really sophisticated framework for resolving disputes.
How did it work?
It emphasized peace, consensus, restoring harmony, often used community councils, elder mediation, compensation, rather than just purely punitive measures. A very advanced approach to justice, really.
Moving across the continent now to the southwest, the Pueblo civilizations. They also show incredible adaptation in complex societies.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
These are descendants of the ancestral Pueblo people, and they've lived in that arid region for millennia. They're rightly famous for their architecture.
The permanent villages, the cliff dwellings.
Right, villages of stone and adobe, these multi-story complexes that look like apartment buildings, and those incredible cliff dwellings you see at places like Mesa Verde or Chaco Canyon.
How did they manage to sustain large populations in such a tough environment?
Through incredibly sophisticated agriculture, especially maize, beans, and squash. And they made it possible with these intricate irrigation canal systems they built over vast distances.
Amazing engineering. And their governance.
Often in places like the Tua Pueblos, it was quite theocratic.
Yeah.
Religious and civic life were deeply intertwined. Many had dual moiety systems like winter people and summer people, often led by spiritual leaders called cacique.
Cacique.
Yeah, often lifetime appointments. Religious societies were central to community life, and land was typically held communally, not privately.
And what about gender roles in Pueblo societies? How did that work?
Well, the sources suggest they were often complementary and relatively egalitarian compared to Europe. Men usually focused on farming, hunting, weaving. Women were central to building and maintaining homes, pottery, gathering wild foods, processing food, preparing meals.
Shared childcare?
Yeah, both shared in childcare. And it's worth noting, in some of the eastern pueblos, women could even hold high leadership roles, like cacique, And they generally had considerable agency in personal decisions like courtship and marriage.
Another really fascinating region is the Pacific Northwest. Cultures like the Maka or the Kwakwaka'wakw. Very different environment there.
Totally different. Rich coastal resources, especially salmon, supported relatively dense populations living in permanent towns. Their societies were known for complex social stratification.
Classes.
Yeah, you had nobles, commoners, and also enslaved people, often captured in warfare or their descendants. Status was hereditary, and it was publicly affirmed through this central institution, the potlatch.
Ah, yes, the potlatch. That seems quite different from European ideas about wealth.
Fundamentally different. It involved the host conspicuously displaying and then redistributing wealth, giving it away.
So it wasn't about hoarding wealth.
Not at all. It was about validating your rank, your titles, confirming rights to resources by demonstrating your capacity to give. It prioritized generosity and social obligation over personal accumulation. A really sophisticated socioeconomic and political framework.
Which colonists often misunderstood?
Completely misunderstood and eventually suppressed. Governance there was typically based on clans or lineages, with chiefs or headmen controlling access to resources within their ancestral territories, what some call whole-holthy.
And they had a deep understanding of their ecosystem.
Oh, profound. Sustainable practices, spiritual respect were key. Whaling, for groups like the Maka and Nuchinolth, was crucial not just for food, but socially and spiritually. Led by chiefs with ritual distribution, the potlatch was also a way to affirm rights and resolve disputes over territory and resources. And they had broader legal traditions, too, things like public lecturing, storytelling, shaming, even humor used to maintain social order.
The sources also briefly mention some earlier eastern woodland cultures, like Adena and Hopewell.
Right, yeah. These came before the Mississippian cultures. They're known for really extensive trade networks across vast distances, moving things like copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachians, shells from the Gulf Coast.
Yeah, and they were mound builders, too.
Also significant mound builders. Lots of earthen mounds, geometric earthworks used for burials, ceremonies, maybe astronomical markers. Their shift towards a more settled life, based partly on cultivating native plants, led to population growth and more defined social hierarchies, tribes, maybe early chiefdoms.
And quickly, the Hohokam culture in the Southwest.
Right, down in the Arizona desert. Thrived from about 200 CE to 1450 CE. Most famous for their truly extensive irrigation canals.
Canals in the desert.
Hundreds of miles of them. To support agriculture, corn, beans, squash. Their society seems to have been organized around clan or extended family groups. Leadership might have been a patriarch or matriarch, with collective decision-making being pretty typical. Kinship ties were vital for managing resources like land and water rights, forming alliances, resolving conflicts. In the public works, they built those canals, platform mounds, ball courts. They showed a complex social organization, a real ability to coordinate large-scale labor.
Okay, so pulling all these examples together, Cahokia, Haudenosaunee, Pueblo, Pacific Northwest, the earlier groups, what's the core takeaway from the sources about pre-Columbian North America?
I think it just underscores that this continent was absolutely not a blank slate, not some single, simple entity waiting to be discovered.
Right.
It was home to incredibly diverse, complex, dynamic societies, sophisticated governance, unique social structures, deep, deep connections to their environments. Understanding this diversity is just fundamental. You can't grasp the subsequent history, especially the varied reactions to European arrival, without getting this first.
Which leads us right into the second part of our deep dive, that collision of worlds.
Right. The moment sustained contact begins, starting notably with Columbus in 1492. And your sources, they highlight his own accounts, showing that sort of dual perception right away.
How so?
Well, on one hand, he saw indigenous peoples as guileless, maybe potential converts to Christianity. But almost immediately, he also saw opportunities for subjugation. He even kidnapped individuals to take back to Europe. It's right there in his logs.
But those initial encounters, they weren't universally hostile from the start, were they?
No, not always. Trade was often an early basis for interaction, exchanging things like glass beads, bells, metal tools for local goods like furs or food.
Jamestown.
Yeah, the initial reception the Jamestown settlers got from the Powhatan is an example of a more welcoming, or at least cautious, start. Indigenous peoples were certainly curious, but the sources really push back against that old myth that they saw Europeans as gods or something.
Right.
Some accounts suggest they found the Europeans kind of unkempt, maybe unimpressed by their food. They were pragmatic. They selectively adopted European goods, metal tools, firearms, things that offered clear practical advantages.
Even much later, encounters varied.
Absolutely. Look at the Vancouver expedition in 1792, way later. His journals describe the Makah as civil and friendly, wanting to trade. But then some Coast Salish groups seemed indifferent, less interested. And of course, misunderstandings happen constantly, sometimes with really dire consequences, like when Spanish explorers accidentally profaned a sacred Quinault site, or mistook war trophies among the Jamaican. Little things could blow up.
And that early trade, it didn't stay simple for long, did it?
No, it evolved rapidly into a complex, transformative system. European demand for furs, especially beaver pelts for hats back in Europe.
The beaver hats, right.
Yeah, that demand pulled indigenous nations deep into a global market economy. And indigenous peoples, in turn, sought European goods, metal tools, kettles, cloth, and crucially, firearms. This fundamentally reshaped indigenous economies, hunting patterns, even social structures.
And it fueled intense competition among the Europeans themselves, French, Dutch, English.
Exactly, vying for trade partners, for alliances. And that directly contributed to, and often intensified, intertribal conflicts. The Beaver Wars in the 17th century are a prime example.
Who was fighting whom there?
You had the Haudenosaunee, who were allied with and armed first by the Dutch, then the English. They fought extensively against the Wendat, Huron, the Algonquin, and other groups allied with the French.
And firearms changed everything.
Drastically shifted the balance of power. It allowed the Haudenosaunee to expand their territory significantly, but it also created a degree of dependence on European suppliers for guns, powder, ammunition. European goods reshaped intertribal relations in profound ways.
And underlying all these interactions were these deep cultural misunderstandings, often revolving around fundamental concepts like land.
Yeah, this comes up again and again in the sources. It was probably the most persistent source of conflict. That fundamental clash over land ownership.
How so?
Indigenous peoples generally held concepts of communal resource use, a spiritual connection to the land, rights based on occupancy and use, not private property for exclusive, permanent sale. Europeans brought concepts of private property, exclusive title, the right to permanently own and exploit land as a commodity.
So treaties meant different things.
Vastly different things. An agreement that an indigenous leader might see as granting rights to share the land or use resources for a time, maybe sealing an alliance.
Europeans saw as a final sale.
Europeans interpreted it as a permanent cession of all rights, extinguishing indigenous title forever. This conceptual gap wasn't just an innocent misunderstanding, it was systematically exploited by Europeans over and over.
And when peaceful means or these misunderstood agreements failed, things often turned violent pretty quickly.
Yes, coercion and violence were always options, and enslavement was part of this picture from very early on.
Enslavement of indigenous people.
Absolutely. The Spanish and Portuguese did it on a massive scale throughout the Americas, often through organized slave raids, like the Bandeirantes in Brazil. English colonists also participated, particularly enslaving captives taken after conflicts.
But indigenous nations weren't just victims, they made alliances too.
Definitely. They had their own strategies. Sometimes they allied with European powers against their own indigenous rivals. The Tlaxcalans joining Cortés against the Aztec Empire is a famous example. They were trying to navigate this incredibly dangerous new landscape, using their own agency, making choices to survive or gain advantage.
But perhaps the single most devastating, most immediate consequence of European arrival, something the sources really emphasize, was disease.
Oh, this was just a demographic catastrophe on an almost unimaginable scale.
We're talking old world diseases. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus.
Things they had no immunity to. Absolutely zero prior exposure, no acquired immunity. So these diseases just swept through populations like wildfire, often spreading ahead of direct European contact, moving along existing indigenous trade
The
routes.
scale of death, they call it the Great Dying. It's staggering to read about.
It really is. The sources estimate population declines as high as 90%. 90%. In many areas within the first century or so of contact.
90%.
Entire nations were decimated, some wiped out completely. Think about the loss. Losing elders meant losing centuries of accumulated knowledge, history, traditions. Losing adults in their prime crippled the ability to hunt, farm, defend themselves, maintain social structures.
The trauma must have been immense.
Unimaginable psychological and cultural stress, plus malnutrition and low fertility rates in the aftermath made recovery incredibly difficult.
And this massive population loss, this demographic void, it fundamentally altered the power dynamic, didn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It drastically weakened indigenous societies, making them far more vulnerable to colonial pressures. And tragically, it made vast territories appear empty or underutilized to European colonists.
Fueling that myth of the virgin wilderness.
Exactly. That myth that the land was just waiting for them to tame it. Smallpox epidemics, for instance, played a significant role in facilitating European conquest, like the Spanish victory over the Aztecs, who were ravaged by disease during the siege of Tenochtitlan.
And this continued for centuries.
Oh, yes. The Southeast, for example, saw its indigenous population plummet by around 70% just between 1685 and 1790, largely due to wave after wave of disease.
Now, while most of this disease spread was unintentional, just a tragic consequence of contact, there's a mention in the sources, a gritty bit, about its potential use as a weapon.
Yes, there is.
Yeah.
It refers to the infamous incident debated around Fort Pitt in 1763 during Pontiac's Rebellion.
What supposedly happened?
Well, correspondence between British officers shows them discussing, and possibly attempting, to distribute blankets taken from smallpox victims to visiting Delaware leaders. Biological warfare, essentially.
Did it work? Is it confirmed?
Whether it was actually carried out effectively or how much impact it had compared to natural spread is still debated by historians. But the fact that it was even discussed, even contemplated, and apparently attempted,
Yeah, it shows something.
it reflects a truly brutal aspect of colonial warfare, the mindset involved.
Mm-hmm.
But regardless of intent in specific cases like that, the cumulative effect of these pandemics, intended or not, was catastrophic. It undeniably facilitated the speed and scale of European colonization.
Which brings us naturally to the third part of our deep dive, those early colonial conflicts and how indigenous nations actively resisted this pressure.
Because resistance was constant. It's crucial to remember indigenous nations were not passive victims. They fought back against colonial encroachment, against the violence, against the cultural disruption.
One of the
Equally harsh. Puritan chroniclers at the time, they described the massacre in graphic detail, often justifying it as God's righteous judgment against the heathen. Survivors were ruthlessly hunted down. Pequot warriors captured were often executed. Women and children were enslaved.
Enslaved, where were they sent?
Some were shipped off to the Caribbean, sold into the brutal sugar plantation system. Others were distributed among colonial households in New England or given to the Allied tribes. The English formally dissolved the Pequot Nation, even outlawed the use of their name. It was an explicit attempt at erasure.
A grim precedent.
It really set a grim precedent for future colonial tactics, aiming not just for military victory, but for the near-total destruction of resisting indigenous communities.
Decades later, New England erupted again in an even more widespread conflict. King Philip's War, or Metacom's Rebellion from 1675 to 1676.
Yeah, this was massive, devastating, led by Metacom, the sachem of the Wampanoag people who the English called King Philip.
What caused this one? What were the tensions?
Tensions had just reached a boiling point. Relentless English colonial expansion, pushing onto native lands. The imposition of English laws and courts, which undermined indigenous sovereignty. Restrictions on things like firearms or alcohol for natives, and deep, simmering resentment, particularly after the controversial trial and execution of 3 of Metacom's advisors following the death of a Christianized Indian informant named John Sassamon.
The sources describe this as one of the deadliest conflicts in early American history, especially relative to the population size at the time.
It absolutely was. An indigenous coalition, initially led by the Wampanoag but joined by others like the Nipmuc and Narragansett, launched coordinated attacks on dozens of English settlements across New England. They inflicted heavy casualties, pushed the line of settlement back significantly for a time.
But the colonists retaliated.
With overwhelming force and, frankly, extreme brutality. Casualties were high on both sides, but the consequences for the indigenous populations involved were catastrophic. Their losses were at least double those of the colonists, possibly much higher.
And this war, it also has some deeply unsettling, gritty bits highlighted in the sources.
Oh, many. Thousands of indigenous people, including many non-combatants and even the so-called praying Indians, those who had converted to Christianity or were supposedly neutral or allied with the English, were killed or captured.
What happened to the captives?
Many were sold into slavery, primarily shipped off to the West Indies, Bermuda, even Spain or North Africa. A brutal fate. And those Christianized Indians, particularly around Boston, were rounded up out of fear and prejudice and interned on desolate islands in Boston Harbor, like Deer Island.
Interned, like prison camps.
Essentially, yes, with inadequate food and shelter. Many died there from starvation and exposure over the winter. It just highlights the pervasive racial prejudice and fear that gripped the colonies during the war.
And Metacom himself.
After he was tracked down and killed in August 1676, his body was treated with extreme vindictiveness. It was dismembered. His head was impaled on a pike and displayed outside Plymouth Colony for over 2 decades.
20 years.
Yeah. A gruesome symbol of colonial victory and a stark warning to other indigenous peoples. The war effectively crushed organized indigenous resistance in southern New England. It led to massive further land loss and forced survivors to either flee north to join groups allied with the French or try to survive in fragmented communities on the margins of colonial society.
Of course, resistance wasn't just limited to New England. We should mention other significant examples.
Absolutely. The Pueblo Revolt in 1680 down in the Southwest, that's another critical example of successful coordinated resistance.
What happened there?
Led by a Tewa religious leader named Pope. It was a unified uprising of numerous Pueblo nations against harsh Spanish colonial rule. They were targeting Spanish religious persecution, forced labor demands, and the suppression of their traditional culture and religion.
And they succeeded.
Remarkably successful, yes. They managed to drive the Spanish colonists and authorities completely out of New Mexico. They maintained their independence for 12 years.
12 years.
During which they revived their traditional spiritual practices and governance systems. Now, the Spanish did eventually reconquer the region, starting in 1692, but they did so on slightly different terms, allowing for a bit more accommodation of Pueblo culture than before. The revolt left a lasting legacy.
And later on, after the British had defeated the French, there was Pontiac's Rebellion.
Right, 1763 to 1766. This followed the French and Indian War, when British policies in the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley became much harsher than French ones had been. It was a major pan-Indian alliance.
Who was involved?
Nations like the Ottawa, led by Pontiac himself, but also Delaware, Shawnee, Seneca, Miami, Potawatomi, many others. They were inspired partly by a religious prophet named Nealon, who called for rejecting European ways and goods and driving the British out.
And they attacked British forts.
Attacked most of the British forts west of the Appalachians, capturing many of them. While they ultimately couldn't expel the British completely, their resistance really shocked the British government. It forced them to reconsider their policies towards westward expansion.
Leading to the Royal Proclamation.
Exactly. The Royal Proclamation of 1763, which tried, though, as we said, largely ineffectively, to establish a boundary line and regulate the westward movement of colonists, partly to avoid further costly conflicts.
So what's the main takeaway from looking at these conflicts, this era of resistance?
I think the key takeaway is that indigenous peoples were absolutely powerful, active agents in their own history. They were determined to resist the existential threat posed by colonial expansion.
Using different strategies.
Right. They employed sophisticated diplomacy. They formed strategic alliances both with other indigenous nations and sometimes temporarily with European powers. And they engaged in fierce armed struggle when necessary.
But they faced overwhelming force.
Overwhelming force and increasingly brutal tactics from the colonists. Tactics that specifically targeted non-combatants, women, children, the elderly, and aimed not just at military defeat, but at cultural and societal destruction. And that widespread use of enslavement of captives taken in these wars, that's a critical, often under-acknowledged part of this history that the sources bring out.
Which leads us directly to the fourth part of our deep dive, focusing squarely on what drove so much of this conflict: land, treaties, and that recurring pattern of betrayal.
Yeah, the sources are crystal clear on this. That insatiable European hunger for land was the primary engine driving colonial expansion and conflict.
Rationalized by ideas of superiority.
Fueled by a sense of European superiority, sure, but also fundamentally enabled by that deep difference in how land itself was understood.
Right. We talked about the different concepts earlier, communal resource versus private property.
Exactly. Indigenous peoples generally viewed land as, a communal resource, something deeply connected spiritually, to be used and sustained, not a commodity to be bought and sold permanently like a pair of shoes. Europeans brought this concept of private property, exclusive title, absolute ownership.
So agreements were just interpreted differently.
Totally differently. An agreement that indigenous leaders might have seen as allowing shared access or granting use rights for hunting or farming, or maybe cementing a friendship. Europeans systematically interpreted it as a permanent cession of all rights, extinguishing native title forever.
And this wasn't just an innocent misunderstanding.
No, the sources make it clear this conceptual gap wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was often cynically exploited.
Can you give us an example from the sources? One particularly, egregious, gritty bit involving a broken agreement or outright fraud.
Oh, the walking purchase of 1737 in Pennsylvania is just a prime and, frankly, infuriating example of outright fraud.
The walking purchase, what was that?
Well, colonial authorities in Pennsylvania specifically, William Penn's sons and their agent, James Logan, they claimed they had found an old, maybe questionable deed from 1686. This deed supposedly granted them land extending as far west as a man could walk in a day and a half.
Oh, walk.
Traditionally, in Lenape culture, that would imply a leisurely pace, following river bends, maybe stopping to smoke a pipe. A reasonable distance. But the proprietors utterly manipulated it. They advertised for and hired the fastest runners they could find. They had a path secretly cleared ahead of time to make the going easier and faster. And they offered a big prize for the runner who covered the most ground.
So it wasn't a walk at all. It was basically a rigged race designed to grab as much land as possible.
Precisely. They covered an enormous area, something like 1,200 square miles, over 750,000 acres. Far, far more land than the Lenape leaders who supposedly agreed to the original concept ever envisioned or intended.
And the Lenape?
They protested vehemently. They recognized the fraud immediately. But they were forced off the land anyway. The sources even note that the Pennsylvania authorities enlisted the help of the Iroquois Confederacy, who were then allied with the Pennsylvanians and had some authority over the Lenape to enforce the removal.
That must have created just deep resentment and mistrust among the Lenape.
Oh, absolutely. It was a stark betrayal. Especially when you compare it to William Penn's own earlier treaties, around 1682. Those are often held up as models of, peaceful negotiation, fair purchase for land use, establishing friendship. His sons clearly abandoned that spirit entirely.
And the consequences.
The walking purchase deeply embittered the Lenape. It contributed significantly to their displacement westward, out of their ancestral homeland in the Delaware Valley, and pushed them towards eventually allying with the French against the British in later conflicts. It was a turning point.
And beyond these specific fraudulent treaties, there was just that constant, unrelenting pressure of colonial expansion, wasn't there?
Just settlers always pushing west, constantly pushing, often ignoring boundaries set by treaties or even by their own colonial governments. We mentioned the Royal Proclamation of 1763 earlier, the British attempt to draw a line along the Appalachians after Pontiac's rebellion.
Yeah, largely ineffective, you said.
Deeply unpopular with colonists and land speculators and, largely ineffective at stopping that westward surge. This constant pressure for more land, always backed by the threat or the reality of force, just meant perpetual insecurity and conflict for indigenous communities trying to hold on to their homes.
And those alliances with European powers, while maybe offering temporary advantages, they weren't really genuine partnerships in the long run, were they?
No, the sources show they were often just instruments of imperial strategy. European powers offered trade goods, military support, diplomatic recognition, primarily to gain allies against their own European rivals. France against Britain, Britain against France, and so on.
So indigenous nations were caught in the middle.
Caught in the middle, yes. They certainly tried to navigate this complex, dangerous situation, often attempting, quite skillfully sometimes, to play the European powers off against each other to protect their own interests, maintain some autonomy. But the long-term outcome, almost invariably, was the erosion of their land base and their sovereignty.
Especially when Europeans fought each other.
Right. European victories in their own imperial wars, like the French and Indian War, frequently resulted in huge swaths of indigenous territory being transferred from one European power to another on paper, without any consultation or consent from the people who actually lived there and considered it their homeland.
So the gritty reality here, it's not just about overt military conquest.
Not just that. It's also about this pervasive use of deception, legal manipulation, the cynical exploitation of cultural differences, especially regarding land, to systematically strip indigenous peoples of their ancestral homelands. It was a multi-pronged assault.
Okay, so to wrap things up, let's look at the varied colonial experiences. Because colonization wasn't just one single story, right? Different European powers had different approaches.
Exactly. It's crucial to understand that colonization wasn't monolithic. The Spanish, French, Dutch, and English had distinct strategies, different priorities, and this created very different kinds of relationships with indigenous nations in different regions. It fundamentally shaped the regional histories we see developing.
Let's start with Spanish colonization. We touched on the Southwest and Florida. What defined their approach?
Their model was heavily focused on three things: the mission system, resource extraction, especially searching for gold and silver, and forced labor systems like the encomienda and later the repartimiento.
The missions weren't just about religion.
No, they aimed not just at religious conversion, but a total acculturation, disrupting traditional indigenous social and political structures, forcing them into settled agricultural life centered on the mission, compelling labor for the benefit of the mission or the colony.
Did indigenous people adapt or blend beliefs?
There was definitely some religious syncretism, yes. Blending of indigenous and Catholic beliefs and practices. The Virgin of Guadalupe in Mexico being linked to the Aztec mother goddess Tonantzin is maybe the most famous example. But overall, Spanish rule was generally very harsh, very demanding, which is why it provoked major resistance, like the Pueblo Revolt we discussed earlier.
Okay, how did the French approach differ, say, in New France, Canada, and the Great Lakes region?
Very different focus. It was driven primarily by the fur trade. So the French generally sought commercial partnerships and military alliances with indigenous nations groups like the Wendat, Huron, the Algonquin, the Innu. They needed indigenous partners for the fur trade to even function.
Less focused on large-scale settlement.
Much less emphasis on large-scale agricultural settlement that would immediately displace populations, compared to the English later. This tended to lead to more interdependent relationships, at least initially.
And French traders lived among indigenous communities.
Yeah, the traders, the coureurs de bois, often lived among indigenous communities, learned languages, formed personal relationships, and frequently intermarried. This led to the development of distinct Métis communities, people of mixed indigenous and French ancestry.
But it still caused conflict.
Oh, yes. While maybe less directly confrontational over land at first, the French presence and the fur trade itself significantly exacerbated existing intertribal conflicts, most notably the Beaver Wars we talked about. French alliances and trade fueled those conflicts.
What about the Dutch in New Netherland around present-day New York?
Their focus was also primarily on the fur trade, like the French initially. They established a key trading post at Fort Orange, near Albany. And they formed crucial alliances, particularly with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy.
Supplying them with firearms.
Yes, supplying firearms was key to that alliance and crucial for the Haudenosaunee rise to dominance during the Beaver Wars. The Dutch territorial footprint, though, remained relatively small compared to the later English expansion before the English conquered New Netherland in 1664.
Okay, so that brings us to English colonization along the Atlantic seaboard. How is their approach distinct from the others?
This is where you see a major difference, especially over time. While trade was important initially, particularly in the early years, the English emphasis was squarely on permanent agricultural settlements and supporting rapidly expanding populations arriving from England and elsewhere in Britain.
More settlers meant more demand for land.
Exactly. This created an almost insatiable, relentless demand for land, much more so than the French or Dutch models. And that led to more direct, more intense, and more frequent conflict with indigenous nations over territory.
So the pattern was different.
The pattern that emerged, particularly in New England and the Chesapeake, was often initial contact, maybe some trade, followed relatively quickly by settlement, then conflict over land and resources, followed by forced treaties that were interpreted as permanent land sales, then inevitable encroachment on those treaty lands, breaking the agreements, leading to further conflict, and the progressive displacement of coastal populations westward.
And religious motivations played a role for the English, too.
Yes, particularly for groups like the Puritans in New England. Their religious motivations certainly fueled efforts to convert indigenous people, praying Indians, but it could also provide a justification for dispossessing those they deemed heathen who weren't utilizing the land according to English agricultural standards.
Despite all these varied European approaches and pressures, it's really critical to reinforce that point about indigenous agency, isn't it? They weren't just passively reacting.
Absolutely not. It bears repeating.
Yeah.
Your sources consistently show indigenous peoples acting with agency, adapting, resisting throughout this entire period. They weren't just victims waiting for history to happen to them.
Using diplomacy.
Sophisticated diplomacy. Forming complex alliances, sometimes with European powers against other Europeans, sometimes with other indigenous groups against encroaching colonists, trying to play the powers off each other.
Participating in trade.
Strategically participating in the European trade system.
Yeah.
Selectively adopting European goods like metal tools or firearms when it suited their purposes, but often working hard to maintain their core cultural practices, social structures, spiritual beliefs.
Resisting.
Adapting.
Resisting encroachment through armed conflict when necessary. And constantly adapting their economies, their settlement patterns, their social structures, even their spiritual practices in response to the immense changes and pressures they faced from disease, warfare, and the changing environment.
So while the methods differed, Spanish missions, French traders, Dutch alliances, English farmers, what was the common thread? The underlying reality for indigenous peoples across the continent during this early colonial period.
I think the underlying commonality, despite the varied European approaches, was that inexorable pressure of European expansion. Ultimately, whatever the initial guise, this pressure was aimed at resource extraction, territorial control, and asserting European political, economic, and cultural dominance over the continent and its original inhabitants. Wow. This deep dive has really shown us, I think, the incredible, often overlooked complexity and diversity of North America before 1492.
Yeah, the sheer variety of societies, political systems, ways of life.
And then it starkly illustrated the immediate and just devastating consequences of European contact.
That unimaginable scale of death from disease, first and foremost.
Right. And the sheer brutality of some of those early conflicts and massacres, Mystic, King Philip's War, things we often don't learn about in detail.
And that strategic use of deception and violence specifically to acquire land, powerfully shown by something like the walking purchase.
We've also seen how those different European colonial approaches really did shape distinct regional histories.
Spanish Southwest versus French Canada versus English Coast.
Yet they all shared that common underlying goal of asserting control in one way or another.
Right. And maybe most importantly, we've highlighted that crucial point. Indigenous peoples were active agents throughout this history, resisting, adapting, making choices, surviving in complex and often courageous ways, despite facing just overwhelming pressures and devastating losses.
Understanding these complex foundations, including those challenging, gritty bits that really complicate the simpler narratives, it feels absolutely essential. It's context for everything that happens next in the history of the United States.
It has to be. It fundamentally changes how you see the continent and the nation that would eventually be built upon these contested grounds, these complicated histories.
Yeah, it wasn't an empty land just waiting for a beginning. It was a place of ancient, complex societies facing truly existential threats and responding with remarkable determination and resilience.
So as you, the listener, reflect on this deep dive, maybe you'd consider this question. How does understanding the sophistication and political complexity of societies like Cahokia or the Haudenosaunee?
Societies that existed for centuries before Europeans arrived.
Exactly. How does understanding that, alongside the brutal realities of their near destruction and dispossession, through disease, through violence, through broken agreements, how does that change how you think about the very idea of the founding of the United States?